This is Ancient Political Philosophy, Monday, October 26th, 2020. What you'll need in front of you is the notes from Friday, which I'll finish up today, and the diagram of Aristotle's universe as the cone. And also I sent out this morning a extensive description and key to the cone as the diagram of the universe, and we'll cover that a little bit. So what I want to do is pick up with where I left up, and then we'll finish with books 1 and 2 of the Ethics today. The reason I decided to do a little bit more talking about this introductory level to Aristotle, and that means, of course, your PRQs for books 1 and 2 are due on Wednesday, and therefore everything was pushed back. I also sent out today a revised schedule, so and you can follow that, and so everything's on Canvas too. The reason I decided to sort of expatiate on Aristotle's understanding of the universe is the more I was putting the notes in the lecture together for Friday, the more I like this idea of Aristotle laying out a certain landscape for humanity. Let me run with that metaphor, because in some ways, one of the things we'll be doing as we work through this material in the next couple of weeks, and ultimately the last week of class when we turn to Cicero, is as I've said before many times, all of these four authors inhabit the same kind of universe, and here's what that means. Essentially, they what makes them and what they have to say about us and our lives, political and personal, and the cosmos for that matter, is what makes them different from any other source of guidance on human life, whether it's the Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, the Mahabharata, or the Tao, or whatever, even great literature, or Homer and Hesiod, the Quran. What makes all these four authors different, of course, is that you could say, beginning with Socrates, they have discovered and perfected the idea of rational self-consciousness as political philosophy. So, in some ways, what makes them distinctive, whether or not you agree with them, or whether you think that their view of the universe is not correct, or whatever limitations you see in it, is they believe that philosophy reveals who and what we are. It reveals who and what we are as collective beings, political beings, and it also, in some ways, shows us the nature of the universe around us. So, what we're talking about in the beginning of the ethics, and in some ways, even as we move through the politics, is books 1 and 2 of the ethics. Book 1 in some ways corresponds to, and what I'm talking about in terms of the universe or the cone, the cosmological landscape, which is what I've tried to portray in this image of the cone for Aristotle, corresponds to the divided line in Book 6 of the Republic. And in some ways, parts of Book 1, and certainly the first part of Book 2, which is about the inner life of the inner landscape of the soul, corresponds to Book 4 of the Republic. So, in some ways, my point about, if you look at the comments on the cone, I'm not going to read through all of them, but I'm going to refer to it and try to explain it. You can read my more than ample explanation that I passed out today. Is that, again, one of the things you'll be doing as you're moving through these authors is seeing how they're both similar and different. In some ways, this ability to see similarity and difference is what I think each of them ultimately means by reason, logos, the capacity to see something in its unity and also its distinctiveness. This is what Aristotle actually calls definition, that when you define something, you're actually seeing the class of things to which it belongs, like Homo sapiens, but then you're also seeing its unique species. So the same part of the human mind that what renders the universe and ourselves intelligible to us, and that is perfected in philosophy, is this capacity of reason. As I put in my notes on the cone, and also you'll see when we turn to the politics, although Aristotle mentions this in Book 1 of the Ethics too, his tripart definition of what a human being is the rational animal, the animal with speech, the speaking animal, and the animal with political life, the political animal. For those of you that had modern political philosophy, this is the critical distinction between the ancients and the moderns. All these four authors, Socrates wasn't an author, but he was a loudmouth, and Plato and Aristotle and Cicero all argue that human beings are by nature political, that the city exists by nature. And you'll see the analogy to this is language. We now know all kinds of important neurobiological research that human beings are pre-programmed for speech in a way that no other animal is. And Aristotle's going to make in book one of the Politics, he makes the distinction between animals that have voice and can express themselves and their sensations and memories and imaginations, and human beings that have speech. I just finished an interesting book earlier this summer, why chimpanzees can't speak, why they don't have language. Because it was thought, especially these experiments where they taught apes and chimpanzees to use sign language on the grounds that, well, every animal has its language, like in some Disney movie, like when Moomba says to Singa, or whatever the names of the characters in The Lion King were, you know, that they talk to each other, just like Dr. Dolittle talks to them, um, but that they don't have the same vocal apparatus that humans beings. This research shows conclusively that Aristotle's right. Animals don't have language. They make communicative noises. They have communication and everything, and they express certain aspects of their inner life. But it's called, the book is fascinating. It's called Why Chimpanzees Don't Speak or Don't Have Language. If you want, I'll find the reference, the exact reference, and send to you. But it confirms that, at least in the way I put it in my notes on the Konas, Aristotle argues that the evidence that we possess an internal power of consciousness, and rational consciousness, reason, that other animals don't, is the externalization in speech and language and the city, as you'll see. So his tripartite definition of human beings in the Politics, but also it's scattered throughout the Ethics. Man is the animal with reason, man is the animal with speech, and man is the animal with cities. The political, rational, and speaking animal. Anyway, so if you're looking at the notes from Friday, I left off with the four causes. The four causes, remember, basically, let's just give you Aristotle's definition of nature, and he says this both in the Ethics and the Politics. The nature of something is what a thing is when its process of development, growth, or birth is completed, has come to an end, where literally all of its potentials that exist by nature have been turned into actualities or activities. And ergeia, that Sachs translates as being at work. The actualization of potential. And that's why a chimpanzee can't learn language, because they don't have the natural potential to learn language. And even these kinds of interesting things, like the wild boy of Avignon that Rousseau discusses, or Nell, the young girl that was lost in the Tennessee woods and then found later when she was older, like around the age of 9 or something. Even if those human beings, it's clear that they'll never develop the full capacity of a human being, because it turns out you need to develop those things when you're an infant. But it's also clear that they had capacities that animals don't have. So anyway, so if you're looking at the notes, let's pick up with the cone. And well, let me just say that with respect to the four causes, what the four causes are, if you remember from Friday, are the four kinds of preconditions that activate motion, that bring a potential into actuality. And one is the matter of what something is made, in which case it'd be our chemicals plus, and then the formal cause that imposes a shape on matter, whether it's like the impress of a clay pot being molded, or a piece of furniture being built according to a plan, or the blueprint of a house is the formal cause of the house. The formal cause, you could say, is the information contained in our DNA that makes me that makes every human being grow up to what they are. And the efficient cause, literally the thing that actually activates or turns on the natural process of growth. The efficient cause of a table is the craftsman who makes the table. The efficient cause of you are your parents, who set in motion the natural processes that gave birth to you. And then ultimately, and this is where the great divide between Aristotelian and Platonic, for that matter, ancient nature and modern nature exists. Whereas the moderns consider natural motion to be simply matter in motion, blind, without chance, that is, as Machiavelli puts it, as fortuna, and then ultimately in scientific literature it becomes to be chance. And ultimately in the Darwinian universe, where things develop, but it's all by chance. Well, according to Aristotle, there is end or purpose in the universe, and it's not accidental. Now, that leads to the great philosophic question, which I can't answer for you in this class, but because in some ways I've been meditating on all my life, and that is Aristotle's view of nature still applicable to us because we live in a post-Cartesian, post-Newtonian, post-Marxist, post-Darwinian world? So are the moderns right that natural motion is not end-directed, teleological? Telos is the Greek word for end or purpose. That natural motion is teleological. Well, the image of the cone that I've drawn is an attempt to show what it means to say that Aristotle's nature is teleological, that it's not accidental the way the natural world develops, and that there is purpose embedded in each nature. And indeed, at the beginning of the Ethics, that's what Aristotle says: all things seem to move to some end, not just human action, but all things move to an end, and that end ultimately is called the good. That's in the cone. That's the tip of the cone, the vertex or summit. And as you're going to see, that's us. So nature wants to produce us, and in each one of us, nature wants to produce rational self-consciousness. More about all this later. So anyway, if you're just looking at the diagram, this is, and I explained in my comments, this is why I chose the image of a cone, not because of the actual shape of the universe. That's not, it's an analogy for the way the universe is organized in terms of motion. And the reason I picked a cone, and I have to say, I claim some credit for this device of pedagogy as a means of explanation or an image. But I think it is useful, and the more I've thought about this over the years, the more I think this is an accurate portrayal of the way Aristotle understands the universe. Remember, the definition of a cone is a geometrical 3D geometrical figure, which is essentially concentric circles, but unlike a cylinder, where the same size circle constitutes the entire length of, in other words, a cylinder is literally a circle extended in space vertically, as opposed to a sphere, which is a circle rotated. But a cone is a circle that, as it extends upward in vertical space, shrinks to the point where you have the base of the cone, the largest element of the cone, and at the top you have the summit or vertex that consists of a single point. And so, as you're going to see, that's a useful way of seeing the way Aristotle views the universe, because how is this the universe? Well, most of what the universe is matter. I mean, Aristotle would have no problem with the periodic table of elements from Mendeleev. Mendeleev, and he would argue, yeah, of course, there's tons of matter in the universe, lots of tons of matter, and he wouldn't have any problem with telescopes or the Hubble, saying that we live in this vast expanse of matter extended in space, perhaps beginning with the Big Bang, perhaps beginning with the first broadcast of the Big Bang Theory. I just don't know. Anyway, so there's no question that inert matter, or even active matter in the sense of chemical reactions, like what happens inside of stars and galaxies and the formation of nebulae and all this, and mountains and planets, the great vast bulk of the universe is matter in motion, but not life. And so the other thing you have to look at my sheet to describe this cone is the idea of an cuspal point, because the overall arrangement of the universe from base to summit or vertex, is with respect to motion, complexity of motion. Matter at the base of the cone is least active. It's simply matter holding onto shape, whether it's a mountain or a planet, because of gravity and these kind of forces that hold matter together. Maybe the 4 internal nuclear forces within, or the 4 forces: gravity, weak nuclear force, strong nuclear force, and electrical charge, I believe, are the 4 physical forces that determine material existence. Anyway, as you move up, what the vertical direction of the cone is complexity of motion. As the universe gets smaller and smaller, that's the wrong way to put it. as you move up in complexity of motion, um, and I'll just quickly go over the major cuspal points, and just to look on my sheet what a cusp is. A cusp is a process in nature where you add by degree or amount, but then you reach certain points where adding one more degree of whatever it is that you're doing, whether it's heat and temperature, and I gave the analogy to water and ice, that that phenomenon, that substance begins to behave very differently. Hence, beneath 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 degrees Celsius or centigrade, water is a solid. It'd be ice. But then the moment if you keep adding degrees of temperature, there'll come a point where it's not that you get warmer ice, you get something that behaves. You get water as a liquid, and it behaves quite differently. The phenomenon is different. But then you keep on adding temperature, you get hotter and hotter water, but all you get is hot water when you add degrees of temperature until you get to 202 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius, and then you get steam. In other words, it's all the same substance, but its behavior, its phenomenal behavior is quite different. And each one of those points where the substance of something changes its phenomenal behavior and behaves differently is a cusp. That's what the concept of a cusp in astrology is, between one sign and another. It means a kind of a boundary, but the critical thing is that you see it's a boundary in phenomenal behavior. And so for Aristotle, when you look at the world, it can be arrayed from essentially inert matter that behaves the core laws of physics. But then you get to this point where the chemical energy of a substance, if you wanted to use modern terms, behaves quite differently. And that's, for Aristotle, that's the first great division. And in this cone image, that's what I do. I put a plane intersecting through the cone, and as you intersect planes, you go up in the cone, the resultant circle on the plane gets smaller and smaller until right at the top, if you draw a plane tangent to just touching the top point, the circle described is just one point. So, so the thing to note by this image is you go up, the circles get smaller. The part of the universe that embodies this higher form of activity, motion, or consciousness gets smaller. And after all, the amount of matter on the earth, for instance, that constitutes life is tiny compared to the amount of chemical and other substantive matter. The amount of animal life out of plants is tiny. And the amount of human life out of animal life is even tinier. And that's what I think the usefulness of this analogy is. How can something be both singular and like and unlike something? And in some ways, that's the very point about the top of the cone. It is a part of the cone. The cone needs it. It looks up to the point. And if you took that one point off the cone, you wouldn't have a cone anymore. It would be incomplete. In the same way, that's the analogy to us, to the human mind. The human mind, human beings, human life, human consciousness is the top of the cone. It's what the universe wants to produce. In some ways, this is not, as I said earlier, unlike Plato's The Divided Line, where at the top is the idea of the good that unites knowing and being. There's, again, this image is like that, but Aristotle describes this cosmological landscape in a way that's quite different from the divided line of the Republic and the Platonic understanding of being. And when we turn to the question of the manner of writing, I think that there's not only difference of substance of presentation of the cosmological landscape and the human landscape and the inner psychological landscape, these three landscapes. I like that image, as I said earlier. But as you're going to see, it's also reflected in the manner of writing. If you haven't noticed now, Aristotle writes profoundly different from the Platonic dialogues. Aristotle wrote treatises, and we'll talk about that in a minute as to what that means. So, if you're just to finish with the cone and then move on, but why do you need this is to understand, for instance, why Aristotle argues we're the only being that needs ethical training. Dogs and cats' behavior can be shaped by environment, but they don't have an inner ethical life. And of course, you're going to see the other thing is, as you move up towards consciousness and self-consciousness, is freedom. The more conscious you are, the freer you are. And ultimately, that the freest part of the cone, which is both produced by the cone and yet transcends it, is that top point. And that's why Aristotle argues that we need ethical self-training. It's because we're the only animal that is, in our consciousness, is free enough to actually see ourselves in the universe, that we can see ourselves, but then we need to see ourselves. We're the only animals that we know of that need to see who and what we are before we can be who and what we are. Every other animal moves pretty much by instinct. The intricate web of a spider is not because the spider has read Aristotle's work on spiderosity, they just do it because it's programmed into them. We have programmed instincts too because we're animals. And by the way, that was the other point I made. If you look at the intersecting cones, human beings are at the top, that point, singular, nevertheless embody the entire, because you and I are both made of matter. And let's go from the bottom to, so you have matter maintaining stable form, but still chemical. And then the great distinction is between non-life and life, that lowest intersecting plane. And what happens when matter reaches the cuspal point where life begins is it exhibits two motions, powers, that material existence, non-life, doesn't exist. Aristotle calls those two functions reproduction and nutrition. All living things eat, that is to say, they absorb nutrients from the outside, and it becomes part of their inner physiology and physiognomy, and they reproduce, and then, of course, that's plants. But all animals do that, or all living things do that. But then as you move up, then you reach the point where there's something added. That next cuspal point is between plants and animals, and that's locomotion. Aristotle calls it the ability to move yourself around in the world, to move, to animate your motion. But in order to do that, that's also incident with another power called sensation. Because if you're moving around in the universe, the reason trees don't need reading glasses is because they don't walk around. Oh, there was that tree that walked out in front of me and hit my front fender years ago with my Toyota, but that was a different issue. So animals are different from plants in that they possess these intertwining powers of locomotion and sensation. And then as you go up in complexity in animal consciousness, you reach a point where sensation becomes more complex and becomes memory and imagination. And even lower animals have these powers. Higher animals have, I mean, if you own a pet, a dog, a cat, or a femur, or a ferret, I don't know about, well, even horned lizards, they clearly have memory and imagination. My parents' cats, Tuffy and Pretty Kitty, when you get up in the morning, they are there in the kitchen waiting for you to feed them. They have memory of food. They know that those bipedal can openers, those two-legged can openers that inhabit the house, are there to feed them, and they expect to be fed. They're imagining their breakfast. So as you move up, this capacity for sensation, or seeing or sensing the outside world, becomes more and more complex, so that there's an inner dimension to it, memory and imagination. And then ultimately, even in the higher animals, there's a capacity for judgment. Like if you see the way a cheetah hunts its prey, it makes these split-second decisions. And this ability to assess the motion of the outside world and to judge where it's going, which is based on memory, works through imagination, but it becomes more and more complexity. Aristotle calls that judgment. And all higher animals, orangutans, chimps, whale has that, college students. But then right at the top, consciousness becomes reflexive. It becomes rational consciousness, the ability to see sameness and difference. And according to Aristotle, only human beings have that, and that's what distinguishes us from the rest of the universe. So you're going to see this is useful for understanding why Aristotle claims in the Ethics that human beings need ethics. That is to say, they need moral shaping. They need to see who and what they are in order to achieve the proper shaping of themselves and their children and their societies in terms of morality. So if you have any other questions about the image of the cone and how we will refer to it, because in some ways, this is what I want to take away as we move towards the other material on the lecture notes from Friday, is that remember, we are at the top. We're the singular, unique point that is the completion of the rest of the universe. And when we do that work, that Sachs translates as energeia, the being at work, when we're doing the powers that nature has bequeathed to us and made us both connected and dissimilar from the rest of the universe, then literally the universe comes into being. Without that top point, the cone would be incomplete. Without the human mind seeing itself in the universe, constructing itself in politics, shaping itself in terms of moral character, and ultimately in contemplative philosophy, seeing the human world and the human being against the whole of the universe, then literally the universe comes into being. When the top of the cone does its work, its activity, then the cone becomes a whole, and that is good. The end at which all things um, aim, the good, which is what Aristotle portrays in Book One of the Ethics. So just a couple. So that on Aristotle's universe, the cosmological landscape that helps human beings see how they're different from the rest of the world and yet connected to it, and that helps, and then so this was the last point I wanted to make in terms of your understanding that diagram. So the human beings are the point, but then if you took another microscope and looked at the point, you'd see that that point, the human point of the cone, also is a microcosm of the cone, because you and I, for instance, we have the same material that stars are made of, phosphorus and lots of, in my case, phosphorus and carbon and all that other gunk down there. And you and I are animal. We're living beings. We have nutrition and locomotion, nutrition and reproduction. We're animals. We have locomotion and sensation. We're higher animals. We have judgment, memory, imagination. But then, so everything that's in the universe, in that entire cone, is also in you and I individually. And as you'll see when we turn to the politics, there's another overlapping cone, and that's the human world of associations or communalities. And it turns out all the associations that human beings are capable of reflect the variety of powers in the universe too. Um, as you'll see in the Book One of the Politics, where Aristotle argues that the three associations of human life, commonalities, are the family or household, the village, and then the highest and most comprehensive association is the city. So at the top of that cone are two other overlapping conads, the political social world, and then ultimately the psychological and individual world of each human being, which is like and unlike the whole. All right, sameness and difference. All right, so at the end of the first page of the notes on Friday, Roman numeral 4, I talk about the different kind of writing, because obviously once you start reading Aristotle, you see this is a very different literary universe than what you're used to. Now, according to tradition and history and biography, Plato also wrote treatises and Aristotle also wrote dialogues, but we don't really know that. All that survives is the writings that we have in front of him. Plato did write 7 extensive letters to individuals over the course of his life, which have survived, and scholars and historians of philosophic literature generally attribute those to Plato. But generally speaking, what Plato presented to the world as philosophy were his 34 dialogues. And if you remember Bloom's description of a Platonic dialogue as a little play. Now, let's start out with Socrates, who didn't write anything. He went around talking to people, irritating them, and ultimately having people laugh at him as a fool and an idiot, and becoming so irritated with him that Athens killed him. In other words, as we saw, what that suggests is that this critical activity of political philosophy, which is necessary for human beings to see ourselves clearly and even to see and imperfect or improve the nature of the city, is itself dangerous, because philosophy replaces opinion with knowledge. But the problem is not everyone could be a philosopher, and that means no city can ever be more than a unity of opinion, even if it's being led by philosophers and directed by philosophy at the top. Everyone in the perfect city, the aristocracy or the royalty of the republic, is not going to be a philosopher. And so, in some ways, you could say the irony of Socrates, the man who discovered and developed political philosophy and showed its power to direct us towards truth and happiness, was killed by the city because the way he did it was destructive and harmful to the city. So, as you're going to see, I'm going to argue that Plato did something that Socrates didn't do. He wrote, and he established a school, by the way, and had students, to be sure, like the Thinkery. But at least when it came to writing, Plato, and remember, Plato and Aristotle lived to be old men. I mean, Plato died at the age of 81. I've mentioned several times, and so in some ways, you could say that the nature of Platonic writing at least partially solved a dilemma that Socrates unleashed. Plato found a way of doing political philosophy. Oh, here, if you're looking at the notes, how did Plato write? And you know this because you've read what? The Euthyphro, the Apology, and the Republic. You read 3 Platonic dialogues. And as Bloom says, they're like little plays. Plato doesn't come forward and speak in his own name or lays out a teaching. You have to discover that teaching by doing literary interpretation, just as you would as a play. And so, what does Plato do? He writes complex dramatic dialogues, little plays that mirror complex problems rather than pose answers and solutions or dogmas. People are still debating 2,500 years later what Plato was trying to teach in the Republic. And you don't know for sure because Plato never says, this is what I'm trying to teach. He has Socrates as a character interacting with other characters. So why is this an improvement over what Socrates did? Because A, Athens didn't kill him, as it didn't kill Aristotle for that matter. And so you could say, well, it protects the philosopher from persecution. Because to see what Plato thought, you can't just walk out in the street and talk to him. You've got to pick up a book, and this book is a complex little play. If you read The Republic the way most undergraduates do, sorry, I'm not insulting you, because they skim it. But then, again, what you get is the religious ceremony at the beginning, the myth of air at the end. And if you skimmed it, well, he talks about the soul and blah, 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 and the city and communism and all that stuff. But to really get to the heart of the corrosive aspect of political philosophy, at the end of book 5 and in book 6 and 7, you've got to dig deep, and most people don't do that. So in a way, Plato found a way of raising all the same questions and looking for the same guidance that Socrates did, but without endangering himself. Second, B, he found a way to write and protect the city from the corrosive aspect of political philosophy. He found a way to do political philosophy in some ways that didn't damage or tear apart the city. Because again, if all you looked at the Republic was the beginning and the end, you'd say, well, he does support the gods of Athens. He talks about this religious festival down in the Piraeus, and he talks about the gods directing souls to their just and unjust rewards at the myth of air at the end. So Plato has found a way to do political philosophy which protects the philosopher, protects the city, and allows each reader to find his or her level. The non-philosophic can read without damage and learn something. Again, if all you read is the beginning and the end, you come away a better person because you learn that it's better to be just than unjust. That's not a bad lesson. And the philosophic, the gifted, the hard readers, the A+ students, can actually read between the lines. They can figure out by actually paying attention to this complex material in a way that non-philosophic types can't. It's the fossilized dialectic. And it takes a lot of work, I hope you discovered. Aristotle, as you're going to see, wrote explicit treatises. He has an explicit teaching. He teaches in his own name. His teaching has a content: ethics, politics, rhetoric, physics, metaphysics, and so forth, logic. So his manner of writing is an instruction manual. It actually lays out a skill, you might say, and it's divided rationally into chapters. It's not always clear, for instance, in the 10 books of the Republic, why one book ends and another. Roughly, they're of the same length, and some scholars have suggested that was the length of typical available papyrus scrolls or parchment scrolls, and that's what set the limit to the books. But at least Aristotle's chapters, you still have a book divided into chapters, and you have to see whole and part. But you could say that actually Aristotle writes in a way that's both more practical because it is instructional, and accomplish the same things that Plato was. How so? You still are protected from persecution, and it still has to be interpreted, by the way. Second, or B, it protects the K from philosophy. It doesn't mention the sensitive subject of the gods tradition. And in some ways, Aristotle starts from saying, well, what do people think? And you're going to see in book 2 of the Politics, he consults both theoretical and practical existing regimes. So Aristotle draws the human conventional world as it exists and does the same thing that Plato does, sifts through the different conventional opinions to try to find the truth at the end. But in doing so, you could say Aristotle simply is putting the same problems of philosophy, but in a way, you're going to see when you read the Ethics, aside from all that complex cosmology and internal psychology, you could say the message of the Ethics is if you want to be happy, you got to learn to develop moderation, courage, justice, prudence, friendship, And you have to know how to philosophize a little bit so that you know that pleasure is not the good. There's the ethics in 5 seconds. And that's not a bad teaching. So you could say in this new kind of treatise with chapters, like a textbook. I mean, the reason students like to read textbooks, they don't like to read textbooks, because textbooks are boring, but they're more accessible and straightforward. Well, that's Aristotelian writing. So in a very broad sense, you could say that not only does Aristotle present a slightly different version of the cosmos and human beings in it and politics, although essentially you can still recognize the main outlines of the Platonic universe, and the same we'll see in Cicero. Um, uh, Nevertheless, you could say, whereas uh, uh, Plato wrote and found a form of complex philosophic writing that did everything we just said it did, uh, and made philosophy safe for the city, Aristotle wanted to do writing in such a way so that it wasn't just that the philosopher was protected against persecution and that philosophy uh, was not harmful to the city, but as you could say, Aristotle's treatise makes his teaching more useful for the city. It's easier for the non-philosophic person to turn away from Aristotle and come away with a list of do's and don'ts. So, as you're going to see, I think that does point to a slightly different substance of political philosophy and different purpose and connection between the philosopher and the non-philosophic human universe. So, anyway, the ethics. Um, so, it turns out that what you find in book 1 of the ethics is kind of what I would say is what I described the first two landscapes, the cosmological landscape. It turns out that motion, everything ends towards an end, and then the end at which everything must end must be the good. So as you'll see, that's not just a rhetorical trick. That's why I think that Aristotle argues the world as a whole, nature as a whole, is end directed, has a purpose, has order. Yes, it has chance, and yes, there's evil in the world and everything, but the world's structure overall points up to a certain end or purpose, and that is the good. Um, and you could say, how does he know this? That how does he know that Darwin's wrong? That it's all just accidental matter in motion? Well, in a way, he does start from the human world. He says people do things for purposes; they have an end, and then you'll see that moves up to an affirmation that the universe, nature, is purpose directed, end directed. Teleological is the fancy philosophic term. But then it turns out, what's the human end? And that's where Aristotle whereas at the beginning of book 2 in the Republic, when Socrates lays out, says sometimes you want things for themselves, because sometimes you want things as pure instrumentalities, and sometimes you want things that are both good in themselves and instrumentalities, like justice. Well, it turns out Aristotle then, sort of speak, interviews the human world and asks, what are you guys after? What's your final purpose? What's the thing that you want? Because you don't, not because it leads to something else, but everything else leads to that. And of course, that's the answer in book 1. It's happiness. Now, it's clear, nevertheless, almost the moment that you say that, okay, uh, the universe moves up towards the good. And the good, as humans see it, is happiness. But then, of course, as he points out, interviewing humanity in its practical scope, it turns out that there are different versions of happiness. And Aristotle says, yes, some people think that it's wealth, some people think it's bodily pleasure, it's honor, wisdom. And the ethics will go through all of these. But of course, by the end of book 1, what you got is the answer is virtue. And in Sachs's interesting translation, human beings have an identity bequeathed to them by nature, and that's the whole cone thing. But that because of the self-consciousness and freedom that human beings have, it turns out that there's a variety of human ends. People can come to different answers to what the good is and what happiness is. Now, Aristotle's answer is whatever you want, happiness. It turns out you're not going to get it without virtue. Again, this is essentially the same universe as Plato inhabits. So in some ways, this science/art of directing human beings towards happiness is called political. This is politics. And Aristotle then divides his subject material into two subparts, ethics and politics. the ethics, the science of an art of having a human character that directs you, that embodies the human being at work, the ernegeia, the ergon, the work of a human being, which again, as you following the Cone stuff, is to embody self-consciousness, reflect on the universe, and to shape yourself as a free being. But then the collective dimension of this is politics. So note, the ethics is part one of a larger work that includes the part two, politics, that is political. And in some ways, this also points to the idea that for Aristotle, just like Plato, the political is comprehensive and includes what we would call private life. So the legislator, the founder of a city or a state or a constitution, not only has to draw the broad activities of the structural and institutional life of the city, the legislator also has to point people individually and privately towards what happiness is. Now, it's not Marxism, it's not communism, it's not totalitarianism. In fact, you'll see, as we saw when Plato tries to regulate the erotic so that it simply is subject to the thumatic of the perfected city, there is a different account here. Aristotle subordinates the erotic to the political, just like Plato does. But you're going to see the great difference in Aristotle is Aristotle believes there's a dignity to the erotic, a dignity to the private realm that can't simply be ordered into being or regulated into being or educated into being by the private. Otherwise, and you're going to see in the politics, you'll see if you destroy the private family and private property for that matter, if you destroy the private, you actually destroy human life, human happiness, and you even destroy the city. You turn the city into something perverted and tyrannical. More about that later. So, virtue is the training of the soul that enables you to be aware of what's going on inside of you, and to point you in the direction that nature wants you pointed in. And therein lies not only your moral goodness, and your virtue, but your happiness. So you'll see that this when I say the three landscapes, then I mean the cosmological landscape that I described in the Cone and all that stuff. When I say the external landscape, again, you could say that Aristotle talks about everything that Plato talks about in the Republic, all the various activities and externalities and arts and sciences of human life. But in a way, Aristotle presents them as we see them. When you look around, you see there are, in fact, car mechanics, and there are professors, and there are nurses and doctors, and you can see that some people really want power and reputation. The two presidential contestants, they want power and they want fame, and so I think Aristotle portrays the human landscape really more realistically as we encounter it. The world is a conflicting place of different ends and purposes and visions of the good. And people really do want different things in life. And here's what clearly Aristotle thinks there's higher and lower too. Ultimately, you shouldn't be surprised to hear that the ethics points towards contemplative philosophy as the highest and happiest human activity. But along the way, Aristotle affirms all those things that the non-philosophers want too as ends and goods in themselves. And will find a way to preserve those things so that you don't walk around feeling inferior to the philosophers. You may not envy them, but you don't feel inferior to them either. And by the way, you're not being ruled by them, except insofar as they persuade you of their teaching, as you'll see. Anyway, so book one then points us to the purpose of human life, and that is happiness. And the surest and the different ways to get happiness, there are different kinds of pleasures in life, and we'll have to rank them, and we'll see that's why the good is not pleasure, but the good is pleasurable, but it isn't pleasure. And we'll come back to that in book 10. And so we turn to book 2. And that's where I would say that book 2 corresponds to book 4 of the Republic. But Aristotle gives a slightly different image of when he's trying to. So, in order to be a good human being and sort from the human world all these different goods and purposes, and to train yourself to have an ethos, a character, through the formation of being at work, as Sachs puts it, and to develop a hexis. We'll talk a little bit about that in book 2. And that's why Sachs goes so far as to reorient you in terms of a description or definition of what hexis is, not as habit, although to some degree there is something of the word habit in hexis. The moral life consists of you shaping yourself so that you have these dispositions towards virtue. Now, are those habits? Yes, Although the problem is human beings are born in habit and acquire habits as children based on their pleasures and desires and fears, and acquire bad habits. But here's the analogy: all of you drive, probably, born in America, raised in America, and there was a time when you couldn't drive, and yet now when you get in a car, it's an interesting. You could say that now I can drive because I created the habits of driving, and I don't have to think consciously about every decision in driving. In a way, the moral life is that for Aristotle. First of all, you have to choose it and shape it and decide to do it. And and in the same way that even though you acquire the habits of driving, you can never really take your eyes off the road. That's what Sachs is trying to get by translating hexis as both the acquisition of good moral habits, but not like a robot, but that like a driver, where part of your moral life becomes by the virtue of training in the acquisition of moral virtues, but then part of it is also an active disposition to stay on the road. And so book 2 then starts out with raising the question, well, what's are we free? What is the content of the moral life? And it turns out the content of the moral life is choice and deliberation. And what deliberation is the activity of making you aware of the elements of your choice. Aristotle argues human beings act and choose in a way that other animals don't. Or other animals have preferences and likes and dislikes and fears and terrors. But only human beings deliberate towards the good that they have to see through rational perfection and seeing. And so, in some ways, only human beings need and are capable of shaping themselves as moral human beings, as characters pointed towards human virtue and perfection and the goodness which the universe wants us to encompass. Well, how do you do that? And this is probably the most famous moral doctrine from Book 2 and the Ethics as a whole, and indeed the whole dimension of Aristotelian practical teaching, the mean, to meson, the middle way. And as you're going to see, he kind of lays out the core method and aspect of this in Book 2, and then in Books 3, 4, and subsequently he applies it to the different virtues. And so how does this work? Well, you know that your inner life consists of the rational and the irrational, and the irrational has all kinds of desires and angers and fears and everything, essentially the same content as Plato's eros and thumos and logos. But as a simpler division, you got your mind, the rational part of your character that wants to see, and also when in a morally good human being, it's that rational element that's actually steering the car, and not some kind of unbridled passion or need or childish habits. The moral person shapes his or her character through habits, but the analogy is, I think, as I said earlier, to driving. So how do you do this again? The idea that you attain the moral through the mean is kind of an interesting mixture of reason and unreason. You know what you fear, you know what you want, you know what you desire, you know what you hope. In a way, that's the raw element of our moral choice, action, deliberation, shaping. And so what the mean does is, in the same way that an archer kind of identifies the target by going from like that, or like a sailor navigates by going against extremes and trying to find the middle direction. Aristotle says that's the activity of the inner moral life. Your rational element looks at the way you experience yourself and the irrational parts of your soul, and then like a pilot or like a driver trying to stay within the white lines of the road, you're kind of like, you know when you're getting off the path, because all of a sudden those passions and desires are what's driving you, and not your desire to be something else other than your passions and desires. So I call this in the notes an odd mixture of reason and opinion, probably easier to attain in terms of practical self-understanding and guidance than the Platonic notion of virtue. People want his truth, but they want the truth that works. So I think Aristotle has put a more accessible tool in the hands of the non-philosopher and everyday person, who actually does remember growing up, does remember the passions and wants and fears and desires of a child, and actually does remember, as he or she gets older, the ability to stand outside those passions and not be their victim, but rather their governor and their director. And so, in some ways, in seeing that this can be freely chosen, because we have this kind of freedom of our consciousness, and this is a willed action. This is what Aristotle argues: when you put reason in control of your life by seeing who and what you are, as part of the universe, as a human being, and as the world around you, um, discovering this capacity to steer yourself, you will actually, and by creating a set of habits and dispositions vis-a-vis the objects of action in life, that the aim of this is to create a beautiful character, a noble character, kalos. But that's why Sachs treats it as beautiful. Yes. So you're going to see, how do you know when you've embodied a moral barometer or conscience? That's not the right word. How do you know when you have moral character inside? When you look at yourself and you understand that what you've created is something worth admiring and being beautiful, as opposed to something ugly and shameful. So those are the essential equipment of the moral life laid out in Book 2. And as we'll see in Books 3 and subsequent books, Aristotle applies that to specific issues. So as you'll see when we turn to Book 3, how do you know what's beautiful and ugly in the soul? Because of what's praised and blame. And that praise and blame is the way human consciousness in some ways is pointed in the direction of moral virtue through the mechanism or tool of the mean.